Hey friend, in this video I'm going to be teaching you the simple steps to painting realistic watercolor flowers. I've been painting flowers for it feels like a lifetime, but that's something that I'm most known for is painting flowers, and I have even an entire book dedicated to watercolor flowers called Everyday Watercolor Flowers. And in that book, I break down everything from basic shapes of different types of flowers, from cylinder to bell shape and sphere shape and bowl shape, to how to paint both realistic and loose style flowers. But in this video, let's break down the simple steps on how to approach this if you're wanting to explore painting realistic watercolor flowers on your own. So first things first, start with a tonal or a value study and a color study. So this is something that a lot of, especially beginner watercolor artists, really get trapped in the middle phase, in the mid-tone range of colors and depth, and they don't explore the contrast that you can really get with super deep, dark shadow tones, using really thick and buttery consistency with your watercolor, and then also exploring this extremely light, transparent layers that you can get out of your highlights with using a lot more water, maybe more in the tea or the coffee range. We have a really good video called the tea to butter exercise on my channel that will link in this video, so you can check out what I'm talking about. If you haven't watched that video, it explains everything about tea to butter and everything in between, so you can really grasp the consistency and paint to water ratio. So doing a color study, this is a Patreon exclusive tutorial that I did where I explained this step by step, but basically doing a tonal or a value study, which is gonna show you how much depth you have with one color from your darks to your lights and everything in between. And then also doing a color study by just gradually shifting the hue of a color. So by looking at this photograph of these peonies, some people, maybe beginners or even intermediate artists I've seen, just approach this type of painting with one hue of pinks for the petals and one hue of greens for the stems and the leaves. And there's really so much more breadth and a spectrum of color that you have within even the pinks in the petal areas. We have some brown undertones, some purple undertones and blue undertones, yellow undertones and oranges. And so doing a color study before you even start painting is really going to help you get your bearings once you start sketching and painting your piece, so that you don't just approach it and start feeling lost about where to place certain colors, even when it's your dark colors and your light colors. But even more so than that, like where to put your yellow greens, your blue greens, your more brownish greens. So doing a color study and a tonal value study is going to be a very informative first step to do when you're trying to paint more realistic. And then the second step is to really understand the structure and the shape of your subject first. So in this case, flowers. For this peony, I did 2 different buds, and these overall, the basic shape of these 2 buds is an oval or kind of like a bean shape on its side. And so I didn't start with the contour drawing right from the get-go. I started with the structure and the basic shape of the flower first, being an oval, and pulled out C curves and C curves going up and C curves going down for the skirt of the sepal on the leaves of the flower, so that I know placement wise they're all pointing back to the axis point of the flower. If you don't know what axis point is or center line and you want to get better at proportions and knowing how to draw or paint anything, check out my course The Art Within. It has all of that broken down in the foundation section in depth, way more covered than what you would find in art school. So from there, I'm pulling out the basic shape or the structure of the flower first. And it may seem like an extra unnecessary step to some of you, but it really does help in terms of creating the right dimensions and proportions with anything that you're painting or sketching, but in this case, for your peonies. The second step, simple step for painting realistic watercolor flowers, is to analyze every single petal and every single leaf as its own individual painting. So each petal, for example, is going to be hit and absorbing and reflecting the light in a different way than the petal that it might be right next to. It also might have deeper shadows than the petal that it's right next to, or lighter shadows more in the mid-tone range. It might have brighter highlights or whiter highlights at the tip of the petal versus the one that it's maybe across from or right next to. So you want to zoom into a painting and really understand the depth but also picking apart each individual petal and analyzing it like it's its own individual painting or swatch. That makes it a whole lot less overwhelming as well. If you're brand new to painting in this more realistic style for florals, is if you take it step by step, petal by petal, and analyze it as its own individual painting. The next simple step for painting watercolor flowers in a realistic style is to use a fun blend of loose and realism. This is gonna be a really simple way of approaching realistic flowers. I love utilizing wet and wet techniques, starting with my darkest darks, my darkest values of a color, and then grabbing water, but making sure I don't have too much water on my clean brush so that it creates a puddle and then therefore creates cauliflowers or these spider web textures when it dries. I like to blend in from pulling the dark color with a damp, clean brush all the way up to the highlight area of the petal, whether that's the top edge of the petal or the side of the petal, depending on what I'm referencing and where the light source is. So I like to start dark to light, and it's all done wet and wet technique. I don't paint wet and dry if I'm trying to do something in a more approachable, realistic style. It's more of this gradient soft blend between dark and light. And so I would recommend starting on your shadow areas with your darkest, thickest, butteriest consistency of your colors, so that you're pulling that from what you learned in your color study. If you're in my Patreon, then you know from that tutorial how to approach that, and then gradually wetting that and making it go into a lighter value. And then my final simple step for painting realistic watercolor flowers is kind of similar to our third step, or whatever step that was, about analyzing the basic shape and structure. But when you are actually painting and you're using your wet and wet technique and analyzing where to place your darker values and your lighter values, think of each individual petal, each stem, each leaf as what its basic shape is. What is the curve of that subject, of that area of the painting? So for example, the stems are cylinder shapes. They're not just flat, two lines with a flat surface. They round, they curve, they're cylinders. So analyzing where the light source is and knowing where the darker tones or values on your cylinder would be versus where your highlights would be, and zooming in on your reference photo or subject to really analyze where the shadows start to merge into your highlights is going to help add dimension, help give it this realistic feel without much effort, because we're not sitting there and doing all these fine little hyper realistic details. We're just getting a basic shading between lights and darks by knowing and understanding that the stem is a cylinder shape, that there are curves to petals, and they're rounding or cupping around this oval or ball shape. And so making sure that depending on where our light source is, maybe the middle of the petal is lighter because it's showing that it's further out and it's being hit by the light source, and the edges of our petals are darker or more in midtones. So really understanding the basic shapes, not only for your sketch, but also doing your wet and wet techniques so that you know where to place your darker values and where to place your lighter values in your highlights, so you can show depth and dimension with your paintings. So there you go, the simple steps to painting realistic watercolor flowers. I hope that was helpful. Again, both of these tutorials are inside my Patreon. The color study tutorial is for my $2 and up tier, so you can pay $2 a month, which is less than a coffee, once a month, to access the color study video. It's transformative, and also get access to our art community where you can meet friends, artist friends, and get feedback on your paintings, ask questions, all of that. And then I also have this peony tutorial where I used the color study and implemented it into an actual step-by-step painting tutorial, how to on this realistic peony, for $5 and up inside my Patreon. So you can check that out by going to jennarainey.com/join-community. We'll link to it in this video so you can check it out. And again, if you want even deeper knowledge on the foundations of anything art related, from sketching and painting, etc., check out my course, The Art Within. We'll link to that as well. It's full of flow state stuff, creating your best work, developing your style, and the foundations of art. So as always, thank you so much for watching these videos, for liking, subscribing, for commenting, all the things, and I'll see you in the next video.